My name is Vivienne Holloway. I'm 31 years old and 2 weeks ago at my company's annual gala. The kind of event where the champagne costs more per bottle than my first car. My boss stood at the podium in front of 200 people and announced my salary to the room. Not as a celebration. Not as an achievement. As a punchline. And of course, she said, smiling the way people smile when they know exactly what they're doing, we're so proud of Vivienne. It's remarkable what she's accomplished, considering she came to us from a state school on a Pell Grant. We do love a good underdog story. The room laughed. A few people shifted uncomfortably. My date. The man I'd been seeing for 14 months, the man I thought I was going to build a life with, put his hand on the table instead of on mine. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. I set it down. And I smiled back at her. She didn't know that I'd spent the last 9 months building a case that would end her career. She didn't know what I'd found buried in the quarterly filings. She didn't know that the woman she just humiliated in front of the entire firm had already forwarded 112 pages of evidence to the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower, 2 days before that gala. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it started. My name is Vivienne Holloway, and I grew up in Dayton, Ohio in a house with one bathroom and a furnace that worked about 60% of the time. My mother worked the front desk at a pediatric clinic for 22 years. My father drove for UPS until his back gave out, and then he drove for a different company for less money. They were the kind of people who got up early and came home tired and never once complained about it in front of me, because complaining felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. I was the first person in my family to go to college. University of Cincinnati on a combination of Pell Grants, merit scholarships, and 2 part-time jobs. I graduated with a degree in finance and a GPA that made a few people take notice. I passed my CFA exams on the first attempt, which I mention not to brag, but because it cost me $800 I didn't have, and I studied for it on my lunch breaks for 11 months. I came to Hargrove Capital Management 6 years ago. Mid-sized investment firm, Columbus office, decent reputation. I started as a junior analyst. I was good at the work. I genuinely loved it. The spreadsheets, the patterns, the way numbers told a story, if you knew how to read them. Within 3 years, I'd been promoted twice. I managed a $40 million portfolio and had a client retention rate of 94%. Which the firm put in its own marketing materials without mentioning my name. My boss, Sandra, had been at Hargrove for 18 years. She was 54, Yale undergrad, Wharton MBA, the kind of woman who wore the same understated pearl earrings to every important meeting because she'd read somewhere that consistency signals authority. She was technically brilliant. She was also the kind of person who could make a compliment feel like an insult, and an insult feel like a favor. "You're my best analyst," she told me once, early on. "Just don't make the mistake of thinking that means anything around here without the right last name." I thought she was warning me. It took me a long time to realize she was reminding herself. Her first comment about my background came 4 months into the job. A client lunch, downtown Columbus, the kind of restaurant where they don't put prices on the menu. She introduced me to a client as our sharp little analyst from the public school system. She said it warmly. She smiled. The client smiled. I smiled. I drove home and sat in my car for 15 minutes before I went inside. Over the next 3 years, there were other comments. Small ones. The kind that leave no mark you can point to. When I presented a research report, she'd preface it with something like, "Vivienne doesn't have the traditional background, but she makes up for it in work ethic." When a senior partner asked who'd restructured the Delavan Fund, that was mine. 3 months of analysis. She said it was a team effort and moved on. When the firm hired 2 new analysts from Wharton and Ohio State's Fisher School, she put them both in the corner offices and gave me a new cubicle divider. I documented everything. Not because I planned to do anything with it, just because I'd learned, growing up without a safety net, that records are the only thing that protect you when people decide you don't matter. I met my boyfriend at a friend's birthday party in April of 2 years ago. His name was Oliver, and he was warm and funny and asked real questions instead of performing interest. He worked in urban planning for the city. He drove a 9-year-old Honda Accord, and he apologized for it on our first date. which I found so genuinely charming that I almost told him right then that I was falling for him. He knew I worked in finance. He didn't know much about the industry, which I liked. With him, I was just Vivienne, not the analyst, not the public school girl made good. Just Vivienne, who made too strong coffee and had opinions about documentary films and could calculate a compound interest rate in her head at a dinner party. He met my mother at Thanksgiving 7 months in. She made her pot roast and her cornbread, and he had 2 helpings of both and helped do the dishes without being asked. My mother pulled me into the kitchen afterward and said, "That one's a keeper." I thought so too. I told him I loved him in February. He said it back before I finished the sentence. We'd been talking loosely about the future. A bigger apartment maybe. Somewhere with a second bedroom and actual closet space. He'd met most of my friends. I'd met his parents, who lived in Worthington in a comfortable colonial and had been married for 33 years. Normal people. Good people. I was happy. And then, on a Tuesday in March, 16 months after we started dating, I found something in the quarterly filings that I was never supposed to find. The Hargrove Capital Annual Report is public record. Any retail investor can pull it from the SEC's EDGAR database. Most people don't. I did, because I was cross-referencing data for a client presentation and I needed to verify a figure from 2 years prior. The number didn't match. It wasn't a rounding error. It wasn't a formatting discrepancy. The fund distribution figure in the public filing was $3.2 million higher than the internal record I was working from, which meant either the internal records were wrong, or the public filing was wrong, or someone had deliberately reported a number that wasn't true. I told myself it was a data entry error. I went back to work. For 3 days I told myself that. On the 4th day I pulled the previous year's filing, and the year before that, and I built a reconciliation table in a personal spreadsheet on my home computer, not the firm's system, mine, and I stared at it for 2 hours. Over 4 fiscal years, $4.4 million had been reported to investors in ways that didn't match the internal fund records. The discrepancy shifted between quarters. Sometimes it appeared in management fees, sometimes in administrative costs. It was structured to stay just below the thresholds that trigger automatic audit flags. Whoever had done this knew exactly how to hide it. I sat at my kitchen table at 11:30 at night with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and I thought about every financial compliance course I'd ever taken, every regulation I'd ever studied, every ethics module I'd signed off on. I thought about what this meant. I thought about what it would mean to report it. I thought about what it would mean not to. Then I thought about the clients, the pension funds, the retired teachers and municipal workers and small business owners whose money was being mishandled. I started building the case that night. I need to tell you about Eleanor, not Eleanor the person, but Eleanor the concept. Because I didn't have an Eleanor. I didn't have a dying mentor who handed me a manila folder and asked me to be brave. What I had was something smaller and less dramatic. A compliance attorney named Walter Doan, 63 years old, semi-retired, who'd spent 25 years at the SEC before going private. He'd given a guest lecture at a continuing education seminar I'd attended 3 years earlier, and I'd kept his card for no reason I could have articulated. I called him on a Saturday morning in March. I explained what I'd found. I didn't use the firm's name. I didn't use anyone's name. I presented it as a hypothetical. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" 4 days, and you called me instead of your firm's compliance officer. Why? Because the quarterly filings are signed off by the CFO, and every discrepancy I found was approved at the executive level. Another pause. This isn't a hypothetical, is it? No. He told me to come to his office Monday. He told me to bring every document I could legally access. Public filings, my own work product, anything I'd created independently, and nothing from the firm's proprietary systems. He told me to tell no one. He told me to be careful. I asked him why he was willing to help me. He said, "Because I spent 25 years watching people look away, and I'm tired of it." I worked for 7 months. I used public EDGAR filings, cross-referenced them with fund performance data reported in investor letters, compared them with the fee structures in the client agreements that clients themselves had provided to me when I was managing their portfolios. I built a complete picture using only information I was legally entitled to have. Walter reviewed every step. We brought in a forensic accountant, his recommendation. A woman named Dr. Evelyn Park, who'd testified in 3 federal securities cases, who confirmed the methodology. The source of the discrepancy pointed to Sandra Whitmore and the CFO, a man named Harlan Reeves, who'd been at the firm even longer than she had. They had been siphoning the difference between reported and actual fee revenue into a management entity they controlled. It wasn't billions. It wasn't the kind of fraud that makes the front page of the Wall Street Journal. But it was $4.4 million, and it was real, and it belonged to the clients. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't doing this to get Sandra. I want to be very clear about that, because when everything came out, people assumed this was personal. It wasn't. Or it wasn't only. It started because the numbers were wrong, and I couldn't unknow that. It became something larger because the more I dug, the more I found, and because Walter kept asking me, "Are you sure you want to keep going?" And I kept saying yes. I didn't tell Oliver. Not for a long time. And that decision, that silence, is something I've thought about a lot. The summer was strange. Oliver and I took a long weekend in Asheville in June. We stayed at a small inn in the River Arts District, ate at the kind of restaurants where the menu is written on a chalkboard, walked along the French Broad River in the evenings. He talked about the future with a specificity that scared me a little. A house. A dog. Maybe, someday, kids. He said we without thinking about it, the way people do when they're not performing, when they genuinely mean it. I listened. I smiled. I thought about the folder sitting in a fireproof box in my apartment closet. On the second night, after dinner, sitting on the inn's back porch in the dark, he asked me if something was wrong. "You seem somewhere else," he said. "Just work," I said. He nodded. He didn't push. He trusted me. I hated that I was keeping something from him. I told myself it was to protect the investigation. I told myself it was because I couldn't put him in the position of knowing. Both of those things were true, and they were also excuses, and I knew it. I tried to tell him 4 times that fall, 4 separate moments where I started a sentence and couldn't finish it. Once at dinner. Once driving back from his parents' house. Once at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep, and he reached for my hand in the dark. And I thought, I need to tell him. I need to trust him the way he trusts me. But I had a plan. I'd built a plan the way I build everything. Methodically, with contingencies. I needed to know something first. I needed to know what Oliver would do when it mattered. So I waited. The gala was held at the Scioto Audubon Pavilion on a Thursday in early November. 200 guests, black tie. The kind of event where the firm pats itself on the back for the charitable contributions it made with other people's money. Hargrove's annual celebration of its own excellence. The hotel had been rented out completely. The centerpieces were white orchids and eucalyptus. Each table had a card printed with the firm's logo and the year it was founded, 1987, as if longevity were a moral achievement. Oliver and I had been together 14 months. He wore his one good suit and looked genuinely handsome in it, and I loved him for not apologizing about it. I knew Sandra was planning to speak. She always spoke. And I had a specific feeling, the kind that arrives not as a prediction, but as a recognition, that something was going to happen that night. Call it intuition. Call it the fact that I'd watched her closely enough for 6 years to know when she was building toward something. She took the podium after the main course. She thanked the partners. She thanked the clients. She made a joke that everyone laughed at. And then she pivoted, the way she always did, into something that was almost a compliment. I want to take a moment to recognize one of our analysts who's had a remarkable year, Vivienne Holloway. Vivienne joined us 6 years ago, and I want to be transparent here, because I think transparency is important at a starting salary of $54,000 a year, which, as I understand it, was more money than her family had ever seen at one time. The room shifted. I felt it like a change in air pressure. She's worked her way up. She's built her book. She makes. Well, I won't embarrass her with the current number. Pause. Smile. Suffice to say, she's come a long way from the Pell Grants. Some people laughed. The awkward kind, the kind people produce when they're not sure if they're supposed to. Oliver's hand was on the table. I looked at it. I looked at him. He was looking at Sandra with an expression I couldn't quite read. Discomfort maybe, or calculation, the private kind people do when they're deciding what the situation requires of them. I waited. He didn't say anything. He looked back at his plate. The sound he made, not a sound really, a silence. The specific texture of his choosing not to speak. That's what I'll carry from that night. Not her words. Not the polite, pained laughter from the table behind us. The sound of him deciding that the moment didn't require him. My hands were steady. That surprised me, the same way it surprises you the first time you discover you're more capable than you thought. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I set it down carefully. I looked at Sandra across the room and I smiled. A real smile. The kind that means something other than what it looks like. I knew that, in 48 hours, her attorney would be receiving a copy of the SEC submission. I knew that, by the end of the week, the firm's board would have a letter from Walter Doan. I knew that everything she thought she'd built and protected and controlled was already in motion, had been in motion for months, and there was nothing she could do about it. "Thank you, Sandra," I said. Clearly enough for the nearby tables to hear. "That means a lot." We left the gala at 10:15. Oliver and I drove back to my apartment mostly in silence. He talked about the food. I said it was fine. He asked if I was okay. I said I was tired. He left at 11. He kissed me at the door. I said I'd talk to him tomorrow. I sat down at my kitchen table and I thought about what his silence had cost me. And then I opened my laptop and confirmed that the package Walter had assembled was ready to go. Everything we'd built. Every document. Every cross-reference. Every analysis Dr. Park had verified and co-signed, I'd already submitted to the SEC. What remained was the firm's board, and the board would need to receive their package by certified mail. Walter's insistence. Clean, documented, time-stamped. I didn't sleep. I made tea the way my mother taught me. Too strong and too hot. I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet and I was not afraid. At 12:47 in the morning, I sent the email to the board. The next 72 hours happened very fast, and then very slowly. The board received the package Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, they had retained outside counsel. By Friday morning, they had placed Sandra on administrative leave, pending investigation. Harlan Reeves, the CFO, resigned before he was suspended, which Walter told me later was a sign that he understood exactly what was coming and chose the off-ramp. Oliver called me Friday at noon. He'd heard something from a mutual contact at the firm, a junior analyst who'd noticed the sudden activity and sent a message asking if I was all right. Oliver's voice on the phone was careful, measured. "What's happening?" he asked. I told him I'd reported financial irregularities that I'd been documenting for 9 months. I told him I'd had legal counsel the entire time. I told him I couldn't share specifics, but that what I'd found was real, documented, and already in the hands of regulators. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me? I couldn't put you in that position." "That's not what I asked." And I said, "Oliver, at the gala when she said what she said about my family, what did you think?" He paused. "I thought it was inappropriate." "And what did you do?" Another pause. Longer. I heard him breathe. "I didn't say anything." "I know." The call ended shortly after. Gently, no one slamming anything but ended. I went back to work. In the 2 weeks that followed, I had calls with 2 SEC investigators, 1 Department of Justice attorney, and the firm's newly appointed outside counsel, who seemed relieved that the documentation was as thorough as it was. Dr. Park testified to the methodology in a preliminary deposition. Walter represented my interests throughout. My colleagues were divided, which I'd expected. Some were quietly supportive, One senior analyst, a woman named Daphne who'd been at the firm 12 years and had her own file of moments she'd never reported, sent me a message that said only, "Thank you for doing what I was too afraid to do." A few others kept their distance. One junior analyst told a mutual friend that I'd burned the place down over nothing. The nothing being $4.4 million of misrepresented client funds, but I understood the instinct. People protect the systems they depend on. Sandra issued a statement through her attorney 3 days after the suspension. She denied intentional misconduct. She cited complexity of fund accounting. She implied the investigation was retaliatory, which her attorney apparently advised her not to say, but she said anyway. The SEC issued a formal notice of investigation 6 weeks later. In December, the board voted to retain me as senior analyst and gave me a caseload that was, for the first time in my career, fully commensurate with my output. No one said that this was an acknowledgement of what had been withheld before, but they didn't have to. Around that time, I also had a conversation with the board chair, a man named Arthur, 67, who'd founded the firm with a partner in 1987 and had mostly stepped back in the last decade. He called me to his office, a room full of old books and bad art, and he said, without preamble, "I want to know if there's anything we missed about how you were treated here." I thought about the years of carefully worded diminishments, the erased credit, the way Sandra had trained the room to see me as an interesting exception rather than a professional with a record. "Yes," I said, "there's something we missed." He listened for 45 minutes. He didn't argue, didn't deflect. When I was done, he said, "What would make it right?" I told him. He agreed to everything. "I'll tell you one more thing about Oliver, because it's the part I've thought about the most." He texted me in January, 3 months after the gala. He said he'd been in therapy. He said he'd been thinking about the things he was afraid of, and that one of them was conflict, specifically public conflict, the kind that costs you something in a room full of people. He said he understood now that his silence at the gala wasn't neutral, that choosing not to act is still a choice, that he'd failed a specific test he hadn't known he was taking. He didn't ask me to come back. He said he didn't think he'd earned the right to ask. He said he was telling me because he thought I deserved to know he understood what he'd done and that he was working on it. I read the message twice. I put my phone down. I thought about everything that year had cost me and what it had given me. I thought about the kind of bravery that isn't dramatic, not the kind you see in movies, not the speech at the podium, but the smaller kind. Sitting with the discomfort of knowing something and not looking away. Building a case in the dark for 9 months when it would have been so much easier not to. I texted him back. I said I appreciated him telling me. I said I wasn't ready to talk more, but that I might be, eventually. I said we'd see. He responded, "I'll be here if you decide." That was enough, for now. Sandra's case is still in the investigative phase. The SEC doesn't move fast. Walter tells me we should expect a formal enforcement action by late this year. Harlan Reeves is cooperating with investigators, which his attorney negotiated in exchange for reduced exposure, and which Walter says will make the case significantly cleaner. The firm has retained a compliance consultant to audit the last 7 years of filings. They brought on a new CFO, a woman from Cincinnati as it happens, who grew up 20 minutes from where I did. The first time we met, she shook my hand and said, "I read about what you did. That took nerve." I told her it took mostly spreadsheets. She laughed. "We've had lunch twice. I think she's going to be good." I think about what I'd tell a younger version of myself, one who was 23 and new to all of this and learning for the first time that rooms full of smart people can still look away from things they don't want to see. I tell her, keep records. Not because you're planning something, but because records are the only thing that protect you when people decide you don't matter. I tell her that the work is the only thing fully yours. Not the credit, not always, but the work itself. I tell her that the people who diminish you are usually afraid of something specific, and it's usually you. And I tell her what Walter told me. That first Saturday morning on the phone, when I described what I'd found in the filings and asked him whether it was worth the risk. He said, "The question isn't whether it's worth it. The question is whether you can live with knowing and not doing anything. Only you can answer that." I answered it. I'd answer it the same way again. My mother called me last month, a Tuesday evening after she'd seen a small mention of the case in a local Columbus news segment. She said, "I saw something about your work. Are you in trouble?" I said, "No, Mom, I'm okay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You sound like yourself." That was the best thing anyone said to me all year. There's a photo on my desk now. It's from a financial literacy program I've started funding. Small, 60 students a year, partnered with 3 Columbus public high schools. First-generation kids, mostly. Kids whose parents worked the jobs my parents worked. It's not a foundation, not yet. Just a Saturday morning tutoring program run out of a community center in Franklinton. We teach the basics: budgeting, credit, investing, compound interest. I teach the compound interest session myself. I show them a graph. I say, "This is what happens when you start early. This is what time does to money if you understand how to use it." I say, "You don't need a fancy last name or a legacy connection or the right zip code to understand this. You just need someone to show you." They lean in, every time. They lean in. I think about those kids when things get hard. I think about my mother's hands, and the furnace that worked 60% of the time, and the scholarship that said someone believed I was worth the investment. I think about the 9 months of spreadsheets and the gala and the silence that told me more than any speech could have. I think about what it means to finish something you started. I'm still finishing it. That's enough. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any spiritual sense. I don't think the universe was balancing a ledger on my behalf. But I do believe that the choices people make accumulate. They stack up quietly, invisibly, and then one day they become the thing that defines you whether you intended that or not. Sandra made choices for years, small ones mostly. The decision to introduce me as the public school girl instead of our top analyst. The decision to erase my name from work that had my fingerprints all over it. The decision to stand at a podium in front of 200 people and use my family's circumstances as a punchline. Each one probably felt like nothing to her in the moment. A little adjustment. A small correction to the power dynamic she needed to maintain. But those choices compounded the way debt compounds. Slowly at first, and then all at once. And Oliver. I think about him differently now than I did in November. At the gala, I was angry. I felt the specific loneliness of being humiliated in front of someone who loves you and watching them calculate whether the moment is worth the cost of speaking. That calculation. I saw it happen in real time, and it told me something I needed to know. Not that he was a bad person, just that he hadn't yet learned that silence in the wrong moment is its own kind of statement. What I've come to believe, and this took months, honestly, is that integrity isn't a personality trait. It's a practice. It's something you build through repetition, through the small choices that nobody sees. I built my case for 9 months in the dark. I cross-referenced filings at midnight. I drove to Walter's office on a cold Saturday morning with my hands shaking slightly, because I was scared, and I went anyway. Not because I was brave by nature. Because I'd decided early in my career that I was going to be the kind of person who didn't look away from things that mattered. That decision, made quietly, without drama, years before any of this, was the only reason I was ready when the moment came. I think about the kids in my Saturday program in Franklinton. I teach them compound interest, but what I'm really teaching them is that small, consistent, disciplined choices build things that feel impossible at the start. You don't become someone who can hold a 9-month investigation together by being suddenly brave one day. You become that person through years of showing up, doing the work correctly, keeping records, telling the truth even when it's inconvenient. Sandra had intelligence. She had credentials and experience and 2 decades of institutional knowledge. What she didn't have, what she'd apparently never needed to develop, was the discipline to act ethically when no one was checking. And the thing about that is, someone is always checking eventually. Usually the numbers don't negotiate. They just sit there patient until someone who knows how to read them comes along. I don't think this story is really about me. I think it's about what happens when you build your life on a foundation of actual work, actual integrity, actual care for the people you're supposed to serve, versus building it on the assumption that no one will look too closely. One of those foundations holds. The other one doesn't. That's not justice in any cosmic sense. That's just math. I'm still finishing what I started. I think I always will be. That's the part nobody tells you about doing the right thing. It's not a moment. It's a direction.